The storm came without thunder. That's what the traders remembered. On the 18th of March in 1881, along the unforgiving stretch where Arizona Territory met the Sonoran dust, something happened that would be spoken of in careful whispers for decades after. A standoff that lasted 3 days, a gunslinger whose name was never written down, a child who should have died but didn't. And in the space between mercy and violence, a choice was made that no one could fully explain. The men who were there swore different versions. The soldiers filed no report. And when it was over, 2 people had vanished into country that swallowed secrets whole. It mattered because of what came after, because of who lived and who didn't. Because someone decided that one life was worth more than orders, more than gold, more than the frail peace that hung over that bleeding border like smoke over a dying fire. But before any of that, there was just heat and dust and a man riding alone. The desert between Nogales and the San Pedro Valley stretched wide and colorless under the late winter sun. It was country that forgave nothing. A rider could see for miles in every direction and still miss the things that mattered. The mesquite grew low and twisted. The arroyos cut deep. Water was a rumor you chased until it killed you or saved you, and the difference was often a matter of hours. The man rode a bay mare that had seen better years. His coat was long and stained with travel. His hat was pulled low, not for shade, but for the kind of privacy a man earns when he stops caring what his face gives away. He carried a Colt on his hip and a Winchester across his saddle, both oiled and clean, both used enough that they sat on him like old scars. His name was Caleb Frost, though he hadn't been called that in some time. He had been a lot of things: scout for the army, deputy in a cattle town that no longer existed, pistolero for a ranch boss who'd paid well and asked few questions. He had killed men, though not as many as some, and not always for reasons he could justify when the nights grew long. He had loved a woman once in Santa Fe, and left her standing in a doorway because staying meant becoming something he couldn't bear. He had no children, no land, no allegiance except to the idea that a man ought to be able to ride where he pleased and answer to no one. Now he was riding south, toward the border, because a merchant in Tucson had paid him $40 to deliver a locked case to a trading post near the line. The merchant hadn't said what was inside. Frost hadn't asked. That was the arrangement. But the weight of the case felt wrong. He'd carried it 2 days now, strapped behind his saddle, wrapped in oilcloth. It was heavier than documents, lighter than gold. And it made a faint sound when the mare stepped unevenly, a sliding metallic whisper that didn't sit well in Frost's gut. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself $40 was $40. Still, the sound followed him. The trading post sat in a shallow basin where 2 dry washes met. It was a low adobe structure with a hide-covered awning and a corral that held 3 mules and a paint horse. Smoke rose from a chimney pipe. A dog lay in the shade and didn't bother to rise when Frost dismounted. Inside, the air was cooler and smelled of tobacco, dried meat, and old sweat. A man stood behind a plank counter, broad-shouldered and graying, with a face that had seen weather and worse. His name was Garrett. He ran the post and asked no questions, which made him popular with the kind of men who moved through that country. Frost set the case on the counter. The older man leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to something flatter, harder. Frost held his gaze for a moment, then let it go. He wasn't interested in dying over a locked case in a trading post that would be forgotten by summer. He turned to leave. "Storm's coming," Garrett said. "You want to ride through it, that's your business." "Don't know, but they're jumpy shooting at shadows." Frost didn't ask why a detachment would be holding a stretch of empty desert. He'd learned long ago that the army did things that made sense only to other soldiers, and sometimes not even then. He nodded once and walked back into the heat. But the unease he'd felt since Tucson deepened. He made camp that night in a stand of cottonwoods near a spring that barely qualified as water. The sky had gone the color of old bronze, and the wind carried grit that stung the eyes. He built no fire. He ate jerky and hardtack and listened to the mare shift her weight in the dark. Somewhere to the south, beyond the hills, he heard a sound. It was faint, rhythmic. It might have been drums, or it might have been his imagination, or it might have been something else entirely. He sat with his back against a stone and his rifle across his knees and waited for the sound to come again. It didn't. He slept poorly. His dreams were full of faces he didn't recognize and words spoken in languages he didn't know. When he woke before dawn, the wind had died and the silence felt heavier than it should have. He saddled the mare and rode south. The sun rose behind him, casting long shadows across the broken land. He kept to the low ground, moving parallel to the route Garrett had warned him about. He wasn't looking for trouble, but he wasn't avoiding it either. Trouble had a way of finding a man whether he courted it or not. By mid-morning, he saw the smoke. It rose thin and gray from a point 2 miles ahead, near the base of a red clay ridge. Not a campfire, too much of it and too scattered. Frost reined the mare to a stop and studied the horizon. Then he saw the wagons. There were 4 of them circled loosely in the open ground. Canvas torn, wheels canted. One was still smoldering. Around them, shapes moved slowly. Men in blue, soldiers. They were spreading out in a loose perimeter, rifles held ready, faces turned toward the south. Frost didn't move. He watched. One of the soldiers turned and pointed. Another raised a hand. They were signaling to someone beyond Frost's line of sight. Then he heard the voice. It came from the ridge. High and sharp, carrying across the stillness. A command maybe, or a warning. It was in Spanish, but the tone was unmistakable. The soldiers didn't fire. They held their ground, tense, waiting. Frost urged the mare forward, angling toward the wagons. He kept his hands visible, his rifle holstered. Frost stopped 10 yards out. Frost studied the scene. The wagons had been shot to pieces. Blood darkened the sand near one of the wheels, but there were no bodies. That seemed wrong. "Where are they now?" Frost asked. The lieutenant didn't answer right away. He looked at Frost the way a man looks at something he's deciding whether to trust. Finally, he said, "Across the line, or dead." The lieutenant hesitated. Then he gestured toward the ridge. Frost dismounted and walked past the wagons. The soldiers watched him but didn't interfere. At the base of the ridge, near a clump of prickly pear, he saw what the lieutenant meant. Stones, arranged in a careful line, too deliberate to be natural. Next to them, scratched into the hardpan, were marks, symbols. Some looked like birds, others like hands. Frost didn't know what they meant, but he understood the message. Someone was here. Someone was watching. He turned back toward the lieutenant. "Intelligence," Frost repeated. The word tasted bitter. Before the lieutenant could respond, one of the soldiers shouted. He was pointing toward the ridge, his rifle raised. Frost turned. A figure stood at the top of the ridge, silhouetted against the pale sky. It was small, too small to be a grown man. It stood motionless, watching. Then it moved, not away but down, descending the ridge in quick, uneven steps. The soldiers raised their rifles. "Hold," the lieutenant barked. The figure kept coming. As it drew closer, Frost saw that it was a boy, maybe 10 years old, maybe younger. His skin was dark, his hair long and unkempt. He wore a torn shirt and trousers that were too large. His feet were bare. He was painfully thin. The boy stopped 20 yards from the wagons. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the soldiers with eyes that held no fear, only something deeper and harder to name. Frost stepped forward. "Don't," the lieutenant said. Frost ignored him. He walked slowly toward the boy, hands open at his sides. The boy watched him approach. Up close, Frost could see the hollows in his cheeks, the way his ribs pressed against the fabric of his shirt. The boy's lips were cracked. His breathing was shallow. He was starving. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the boy reached out and took the jerky. "He's from across the line." The lieutenant's face was pale. "There was a group, traitors, we thought." But when we stopped them, they scattered. Some went south, we followed, found their camp. There were families, children. We were told they were smuggling, but he stopped. His hands were shaking. It got out of hand. Someone fired, then everyone fired, and by the time it was over, there were. The lieutenant nodded. Frost's hand drifted toward the Colt on his hip, not fast, not threatening, just a shift of weight that every man there understood. The lieutenant saw it. His face hardened. The soldiers raised their rifles. The boy didn't move. Frost stood between them, his pulse steady, his mind clear. He had been in situations like this before. He knew how they ended. Someone would back down or someone would die. There was no third option. But then something happened that no one expected. From the ridge, a voice called out, low and steady, speaking in a language Frost didn't know. The boy turned. He looked up at the ridge, then back at Frost. And in his eyes something shifted. He ran, not toward the ridge, toward Frost. The boy grabbed Frost's hand, gripping it with a strength that seemed impossible for someone so small. And then he pulled. Frost didn't resist. He let the boy lead him away from the wagons, away from the soldiers, toward the open desert. Behind them, the lieutenant shouted. The soldiers moved to follow. But Frost was already mounting the mare, pulling the boy up behind him. The child's arms wrapped around his waist, thin and trembling. Frost kicked the mare into a gallop. The soldiers fired. The shots cracked across the stillness, kicking up dust to the left and right. Frost bent low, urging the mare faster. The boy held on, his face pressed against Frost's back. They rode hard for a mile, then two. The sounds of pursuit faded. When Frost finally slowed, they were alone in a wide expanse of creosote and stone, the sun climbing higher, the world empty in every direction. He reined the mare to a stop and looked back. No one followed, not yet. The boy let go and slid down from the saddle. He stood in the sand, swaying slightly, still clutching the jerky. Frost dismounted. He pulled his canteen and handed it to the boy. The child drank deeply, water spilling down his chin. "What's your name?" Frost asked. The boy didn't answer. Maybe he didn't understand. Maybe he didn't trust. The boy's eyes searched his face. Then, slowly, he nodded. Frost stood and scanned the horizon. They were exposed here. The army would come looking. And when they did, there would be no more talking. He had made a choice. Now he would have to live with it or die for it. He looked down at the boy, this small, fragile thing that the world had tried to erase, and felt something stir in him that he thought had died years ago. Not mercy. Not quite. They rode south, into country that had no name and no law, where the line between nations blurred into dust and memory. Behind them, the soldiers would be gathering. Ahead, the desert stretched endless and unforgiving. The news traveled slowly at first, the way bad news always did in that country. A rider brought word to Fort Huachuca 3 days after the incident. A telegram went north to Tucson. By the end of the week, the story had reached Santa Fe, though by then the details had already begun to shift and multiply like shadows at sunset. A deserter, some said. A gunslinger who'd killed soldiers and fled with stolen property. Others claimed it was a dispute over water rights or smuggled weapons, or something darker that no one wanted to name. The facts were few. The rumors were legion. What remained constant was this. Caleb Frost had interfered with a military operation, assaulted an officer, though no officer would confirm this, and disappeared into the borderlands with a child of unknown origin. The army wanted him found. The territory wanted answers. And the people who lived in the scattered settlements along that bleeding edge of civilization wanted someone to blame. Lieutenant William Marsh, the young officer who'd commanded the detail at the burned wagons, was recalled to Fort Huachuca and questioned for 6 hours. He told the truth, mostly. He described the traders, the pursuit, the shots fired. He mentioned the boy. He admitted that Frost had taken the child at gunpoint. A small lie that seemed necessary at the time, a way to protect himself from questions he couldn't answer. What he didn't mention was the way his hands had shaken when he'd given the order to fire on the camp. The sound a woman had made before she went silent. The feeling that had settled in his gut afterward, cold and permanent, like a stone swallowed whole. He was relieved of duty pending further investigation. He never wore the uniform again. The Army sent a patrol south within 2 days, 20 men under a captain named Dyer who'd spent 10 years chasing Apache through the dragoons and knew the country better than most. They rode hard, following the tracks Frost had left, easy enough to read in that terrain. The bay mare's prints were distinctive, one shoe worn thin on the left rear hoof. The trail led south and west, toward the broken country beyond the San Pedro, but after 30 miles the tracks vanished. Dyer found the place where Frost had stopped, a dry wash sheltered by ironwood. He'd made camp there, no fire, stayed maybe 2 hours. The boys' footprints were clear in the sand, small and bare. After that the trail split. One set of tracks continued south, another angled west. A third went north, back the way they'd come. False trails. Frost had doubled back, brushed out his tracks, used the rock shelves and hard ground the way a man does when he knows he's being followed. Dyer spent 3 more days searching. He found nothing. When he returned to the fort, his report was brief and blunt. The fugitive had knowledge of the terrain and was likely receiving assistance from local settlements or indigenous groups. He recommended expanding the search and offering a reward. The reward was posted 2 weeks later. $100 for information leading to the capture of Caleb Frost, $50 for the return of the boy. No one came forward. In the town of Nogales, a freight dispatcher named Samuel Holt told anyone who'd listened that he'd seen Frost pass through in early April. The man had bought supplies, salt pork, cornmeal, ammunition, and paid in silver. He'd been alone. No boy. The deputy who took the statement rode out to the place Holt described but found nothing. When questioned again, Holt admitted he might have been mistaken. Maybe it wasn't Frost. Maybe it was someone else entirely. Memory was a strange thing. At the trading post where Frost had delivered the locked case, Garrett received a visit from 2 soldiers and a marshal. They asked about the case. Garrett said he didn't know anything about a case. They searched the post anyway, tore through the storeroom, questioned the few travelers who happened to be there. They found nothing. The case had vanished, along with whatever it contained. Garrett watched them ride away and then went back to his work. He told no one that he'd burned the case 3 days after Frost left, without opening it, because some things were better left unknown. By summer, the official search had ended. The patrols stopped. The reward notices curled and faded in the sun. The Army had other concerns. Apache unrest in the White Mountains, border disputes with Mexican irregulars. A gunslinger and a lost boy were no longer priorities. But the story didn't die. It couldn't. People needed stories, especially in places where life was hard and the days bled into one another without distinction. They needed mysteries. They needed villains and heroes, even when the truth was muddier than either. In the saloons and trading posts, men swore they'd seen Frost. He was in Sonora, they said, working as a hired gun for one of the mining companies. Or he was in the Sierra Madre, living with a woman who asked no questions. Or he'd been killed in a card game in Hermosillo, his body left in an alley for the dogs. The boy, too, became legend. Some claimed he was the son of a Mexican revolutionary. Others said he was Apache, or Yaqui, or the orphan child of missionaries killed in a raid. Each version contradicted the last, but that didn't matter. The boy was whatever the story needed him to be. A prospector named Lyle Canby told a group of miners that he'd seen the 2 of them in the fall of that year, camped near a spring in the Patagonia Mountains. Frost had looked older, Canby said, thinner, like a man who'd been running for months. The boy had been there too, helping with the horses. Canby said he'd approached to offer coffee, and Frost had drawn his pistol without a word. Canby had left quickly. He swore it was true. no one could verify the story. The spring can be described was real enough, but by the time anyone thought to check, winter had come and the mountains were impassable. Years passed. The Lieutenant William Marsh moved east and became a clerk in St. Louis. He married a schoolteacher and had 2 daughters. He never spoke of the incident, not to his wife, not to anyone. But sometimes, in the early hours before dawn, he woke with the taste of smoke in his mouth, and the sound of that woman's cry still echoing in his skull. Captain Dyer retired in 1887 and took a position as a surveyor in New Mexico. He kept a journal, meticulous and detailed, of every patrol he'd ever led. In the entry for April 1881, he wrote only this: "Trail lost. Subject demonstrated skill." In Tucson, the merchant who'd hired Frost to deliver the case closed his business and moved to California. He left behind no records. No one thought to ask what had been in the case, or why it mattered. The trading post run by Garrett burned down in 1884. Lightning strike, people said, though there'd been no storm that day. Garrett rebuilt it 20 miles north and never mentioned Frost again. But in the scattered settlements, in the places where men gathered to drink and tell lies, the story persisted. It grew. It changed. Frost became a ghost, a phantom rider who appeared and vanished like smoke. The boy became a symbol of something people couldn't quite name: innocence, maybe, or loss, or the idea that some things were worth protecting even when the cost was everything. Old women in the Mexican villages spoke of a man who helped families cross the line when the army patrols grew too aggressive. They said he never took payment, never gave his name. He was tall, they said, with eyes that looked through you. He traveled with a boy who never spoke. These stories were impossible to confirm. The families who might have known had scattered or died. The villages changed. The lines shifted. The desert swallowed what it always swallowed. In 1890, a priest in the town of Magdalena wrote to the territorial governor, asking if there were records of a child matching a certain description who'd been taken from the border region in the spring of 1881. He'd been approached, he said, by an elderly woman who claimed her grandson had disappeared that year. She believed he might still be alive. The governor's office sent a polite reply. No records existed. The matter was closed. In 1894, a deputy named Moss claimed to have arrested a drifter in Bisbee who matched Frost's description. The man had refused to give his name. He carried a Colt that looked old and well used. But when Moss checked the records, he found no outstanding warrants for anyone named Caleb Frost. The description was vague enough to match 100 men. Moss held the drifter for 2 days, then let him go. The man walked out of the jail and disappeared. Moss never saw him again. By the turn of the century, most of the people who'd been directly involved were dead or gone. The fort had been decommissioned. The trading routes had shifted. The border, always porous, had become something else entirely, more patrolled, more contested, less forgiving. But in the archives, in the musty rooms where military reports and territorial correspondence gathered dust, a few documents remained. Incident reports filed and forgotten, letters that had never been answered, fragments of a story that no one had cared enough to piece together. In 1923, a historian researching the Indian Wars came across a folder marked Unresolved Incidents, Southern Arizona, 1880–1882. Inside were 3 pages. The first was a patrol report from Captain Dyer, detailing the failed search. The second was a letter from the priest in Magdalena asking about the boy. The third was a handwritten note, unsigned, dated June 1881. The note read, "Subject believed to be operating in northern Sonora." The note had been filed and ignored. The historian made a photocopy for his records, but never published anything about it. The story didn't fit the narrative he was building. In 1968, a university student working on a thesis about frontier justice found a reference to the case in an old newspaper archive. The article was brief, published in a Tucson paper in April 1881. It mentioned a disturbance along the border, a pursuit by military forces, and a wanted man named Frost. The article gave no details. The student made a note and moved on. There were more interesting cases. The years accumulated. The desert, indifferent and eternal, erased what remained. Graves went unmarked. Buildings crumbled. The people who remembered became fewer than none. But objects endure in ways that memory cannot. In the spring of 2009, a man named Dr. Richard Osborne, an archaeologist with the University of Arizona, was leading a survey team through a remote section of the Patagonia Mountains. They were documenting historic sites, old mines, abandoned settlements, anything that might be listed on the Heritage Register before it vanished entirely. They found the camp by accident. It was in a narrow canyon, sheltered from wind, near a seep that still produced water in the wet months. There was a stone ring where fires had been built, bits of rusted metal half buried in the dirt. The remains of a lean-to, just rotted posts and a few scraps of canvas turned to thread. Osborne's team spent 3 days cataloging the site. They found cartridge casings, .44 caliber, consistent with ammunition used in the 1880s, a broken knife blade, scraps of leather that might have been saddle rigging, and in a crevice between 2 rocks, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow survived more than a century, a small leather journal. The oilcloth crumbled when they touched it, but the journal inside was intact. The cover was stained and warped, the pages brittle. The writing was faint but legible. Osborne photographed every page before attempting to handle the book. That night back at the field station, he read the journal by lamplight. There was no name inside, no dates. But the entries were methodical, written in a careful hand. They described water sources, safe routes through the mountains, places to avoid. There were sketches of landmarks, notes on distances, warnings about patrols, and there were other entries, shorter, personal. One read, "The boy is stronger now." Another, "We cannot go back. There is no back, only forward into country that has no memory and no mercy." And near the end, written in a hand that looked hurried, less steady, "If someone finds this, know that what was done by choice. No man can carry the weight of the world, but a man can choose what he will carry and what he will not." Osborne sat for a long time after reading that. The night was cold, and the wind moved through the canyon like something searching. He couldn't prove who'd written the journal. But the timeline fit, the location fit, and the casings they'd found matched the caliber of a Colt used by cavalry scouts in the 1880s. He sent a copy of the journal to a colleague who specialized in frontier history. That colleague contacted an archivist. The archivist found the old patrol reports, the letters, the fragments. Slowly, piece by piece, the story began to reassemble. By 2011, a small article appeared in a regional history journal. It detailed the discovery of the journal and speculated about its author. It mentioned Caleb Frost by name. It referenced the incident at the border, the burned wagons, the boy. The article was picked up by a magazine, then a podcast, then a documentary filmmaker. And in a quiet neighborhood in Albuquerque, an elderly woman named Elena Ruiz read the article with shaking hands. She was 87 years old. Her memory was sharp, though her body had grown frail. She lived alone in a house filled with photographs and the smell of old paper. After reading the article, she walked slowly to a closet in the back bedroom. She pulled down a wooden box she hadn't opened in decades. Inside was a bundle of letters, a faded ribbon, and a small cloth bag. She opened the bag and removed a single object, a child's bracelet woven from horsehair with a small silver charm in the shape of a bird. Her hands trembled as she held it. She had told no one, not her children, not her husband, now 20 years dead. She had kept the secret because that was what she'd been asked to do. because some promises were worth keeping, even when the people who'd made them were long gone. But now, looking at the bracelet, she wondered if silence was still the right choice. The filmmaker who'd been researching the story received a letter 2 months later. It was handwritten, postmarked from New Mexico, with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. It showed a young boy, maybe 12, standing beside a tall man in a long coat. The man's face was turned away from the camera, but the boy looked straight ahead, his expression serious and calm. On the boy's wrist was a bracelet woven from horsehair. The filmmaker tried to trace the letter. The postmark led to a mail center that served a dozen small towns. Elena Ruiz had died 3 weeks before the letter was sent, her passing noted in a small obituary that mentioned her work as a teacher and her love of history. No one knew who'd mailed the photograph. No one knew who Daniel had become, or if he'd lived a long life, or what had happened to the man who'd carried him into the wilderness and refused to let him be erased. But the photograph was real. The bracelet was real. And somewhere in the archives, in the silent spaces between the recorded and the forgotten, the truth still waited. The search, after more than a century, began again. /N the filmmaker's name was Rebecca Marsh. The shared surname was coincidence, though when she discovered that Lieutenant William Marsh had been her great-great-grandfather, the project stopped being academic and became something else entirely. She found the connection through genealogy records while researching the documentary. A marriage certificate led to a census record, which led to a military file she'd already read a dozen times without knowing the man described was her own blood. When she understood, she sat in the archive room for an hour without moving, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, her hands flat on the table. Her great-great-grandfather had never spoken of Arizona. Family stories painted him as a quiet man, a clerk who'd lived simply and died young. There were no tales of military service, no mentions of the frontier. It was as if that part of his life had been carefully erased, cut away like a photograph trimmed to remove an unwanted figure. Rebecca requested his personal papers from the family estate, such as it was. A cousin in Missouri sent a box of letters and documents, apologetic that there wasn't more. Most of it was routine correspondence, receipts, a deed to property that no longer existed. But at the bottom, wrapped in brown paper, was a leather portfolio she almost missed. Inside were 3 items. The first was a tintype of a young man in uniform, stiff and unsmiling, the kind of portrait soldiers sat for before going west. The face was her great-great-grandfather's. She recognized it from the single photograph her family had kept, though in that one he'd been older, civilian, the hardness around his eyes already settled in. The second item was a letter, written in a woman's hand. It was addressed to Lieutenant Marsh but never sent. "William, your mother showed me your letter. I am glad to know you are safe, though I cannot pretend to understand what you have endured. You speak of things that trouble you, but you do not say what they are." The letter had been folded and unfolded so many times the creases had torn. Someone had held it often. Someone had read it until the paper nearly gave way. The third item was a map. It was hand-drawn on heavy paper, the ink faded but still clear. It showed the border region between Arizona and Sonora, the landmarks labeled in a careful script, springs, passes, settlements. "If I could go back, I would, but the desert keeps what it takes." She sat with the map for a long time, tracing the lines with her finger, imagining the young man who'd drawn it, trying to reconcile the lieutenant who'd given the order to fire with the clerk who'd spent the rest of his life in silence. The documentary was released in the spring of 2013. It was a modest production, 40 minutes long, screened at a small film festival in Tucson. Rebecca narrated it herself, her voice quiet and steady, laying out the facts as she'd found them, the journal, the patrol reports. The photograph of the boy, the bracelet. She interviewed historians, showed the landscape where it had happened, visited the canyon where the journal had been discovered. She did not mention her own connection. That felt too personal, too raw. This was a story about choices and consequences, about the way violence rippled outward long after the shots were fired. It was about a man named Caleb Frost who decided one life mattered more than orders, and a boy named Daniel who'd been given a chance to live. The documentary ended with the photograph, the boy standing beside the man in the long coat, the horsehair bracelet on his wrist, and Rebecca's voice, calm and measured, saying, "We may never know the full truth of what happened in those 3 days, but we know this: someone chose mercy." The screen faded to black, the credits rolled in silence. The response was quiet but persistent. A few newspapers picked up the story. A history podcast dedicated an episode to it. People wrote to Rebecca, asking questions, offering theories, claiming distant connections to the events. Most of it she filed away, polite but non-committal. She told the story as well as she could. The rest was speculation. But one letter stood out. "Ms. Marsh, I saw your film. I am 91 years old. My grandmother was Elena Ruiz. She is the one who sent the photograph. Before she died, she told me things she had never told anyone. She made me promise not to speak of them while certain people were still alive. Those people are gone now. If you want to know what happened to the boy, come and see me." Rebecca drove south 3 days later. The town was small and dusty, the kind of place that existed because it always had, not because there was any reason for it to continue. Adobe houses with tin roofs, a church, a gas station, a few streets that turned to dirt at the edges. Maria Celeste Ruiz lived in a small house at the end of a gravel road. She was waiting on the porch when Rebecca arrived, a thin woman with white hair pulled back, her face deeply lined, her eyes sharp and clear. She invited Rebecca inside without ceremony. The house was dim and cool, cluttered with furniture that had been there for decades. They sat at a kitchen table covered with a plastic cloth. Maria poured coffee from a pot that looked older than Rebecca. "You are related to the lieutenant," Maria said. No, but she knew people who did, and she knew the boy. Maria folded her hands on the table. "My grandmother was a teacher. In the 1890s, she taught in a village south of the border, a place that doesn't exist anymore. One year, a man brought a boy to her. The man said the boy needed schooling. He paid in silver. He came back every few months to check on him." Maria smiled faintly. "My grandmother never used that name. She called him El Guardia, the guardian. She said he was a man who carried great guilt but did not speak of it." Maria was quiet for a moment. Then she rose and walked to a cabinet in the corner. She returned with a wooden box, small and plain, and set it on the table. She opened it carefully. Inside was the horsehair bracelet from the photograph. Beside it was a folded piece of paper, yellowed and fragile. Maria unfolded the paper with care. It was a certificate, written in Spanish, dated 1897, a school certificate, recording the completion of studies by a student named Daniel Mora. "Mora," Rebecca said softly. It was the name the man gave him. Rebecca stared at the certificate. The ink was faded, but the signature was clear: Daniel Mora. The room seemed to tilt. Rebecca gripped the edge of the table. "You knew him," she whispered. The silence that followed was profound. Rebecca felt the weight of it pressing down, the enormity of what she was hearing. A boy who should have died, a man who'd risked everything. A life that had unfolded across decades, rooted in a single choice made in the desert in 1881. "And Frost?" Rebecca asked. Maria's expression grew distant. "My grandmother said he left in 1903. He came to the school one last time, spoke with Daniel for an hour. They embraced. Not often, but my grandmother said he kept the bracelet his whole life. And once near the end, when Daniel was very old and sick, he told her this. He gave me a life I was not supposed to have." Maria refolded the certificate and placed it back in the box. She closed the lid gently, as if sealing something sacred. My grandmother wanted the world to forget, Maria said. She thought the story would only bring pain. Rebecca stayed another hour. Maria showed her photographs. Daniel as a young man, serious and lean, his dark eyes calm. Daniel with his wife, a small woman with a gentle smile. Daniel surrounded by children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. A life that had grown from the seed of that single desperate flight across the desert. Maria nodded. Tell it. Rebecca drove north as the light failed, the desert turning purple and gold around her. She thought about her great-great-grandfather, the young lieutenant who'd carried his guilt to the grave. She thought about Frost, the man who'd become a ghost, who disappeared into country that kept its secrets. She thought about Daniel, the boy who'd grown into a man, who'd lived and loved and left behind a family that carried his name. The story wasn't simple. It wasn't clean. There were no villains, not really, and no heroes. Just people caught in a moment when the world demanded one thing and conscience demanded another. She thought about the journal entry, the last line. May God forgive what I could not. Perhaps God had, or perhaps forgiveness wasn't the point. Perhaps the point was that someone had tried. That in a place and time when life was cheap and mercy was weakness, a man had chosen differently, and a boy had lived. The updated documentary was released 2 years later. It included everything Maria had shared with her permission, photographs of Daniel, the school certificate, the bracelet. The full story, as much as could be told. It aired on a cable network and then online. Thousands of people watched it. Some wrote letters. Some shared their own stories of ancestors who'd made impossible choices. Some simply said thank you. In a nursing home in Tucson, a woman in her late 90s watched the documentary on a laptop her grandson had brought. Her name was Ann Dyer, and her grandfather had been the captain who'd searched for Frost and failed to find him. She'd heard stories as a child, fragments her grandfather had let slip late in life. She'd always wondered. Now she knew. She asked her grandson to write a letter on her behalf. In it, she said only this. My grandfather spent his life wondering if he'd done the right thing by giving up the search. In a small cemetery outside Magdalena, someone placed flowers on a grave marked only with the name Daniel Mora and the dates 1871-1962. The flowers were fresh, bright against the weathered stone. No one saw who left them. And in the archives, filed carefully among the other documents, the photograph remained. The boy and the man, the bracelet on the boy's wrist, the future they'd carved from dust in defiance. Rebecca Marsh stood in the canyon where the journal had been found, the place where Frost and Daniel had camped more than a century before. The wind moved through the rocks, cool and constant. The seep still produced water, a thin trickle that gathered in a shallow pool. She thought about what Maria had said. Do not make them heroes. She wouldn't. They were just people flawed and frightened and trying to do right in a world that made right nearly impossible. They'd succeeded barely. And because they had, a boy had grown into a man, and that man had left behind a family, and that family carried forward the gift of a life that should have been erased. It wasn't a story about justice. Justice had failed here, or never arrived at all. It wasn't about the law, which had been blunt and blind and brutal. It was about choice. The kind that costs everything and guarantees nothing. The kind that echoes across generations. Rebecca knelt by the pool and touched the water. It was cold, clean, patient. The desert kept its secrets. But sometimes, if you waited long enough, if you listened carefully, it gave them back. She stood and walked toward her truck, the sun warm on her shoulders, the canyon quiet behind her. The story was told. The names were known. The boy had lived. That was enough. The wind picked up as she drove away, stirring the dust into brief ghosts that rose and scattered and returned to the earth. The canyon settled into stillness. The water kept flowing. And somewhere in the vast, indifferent country that had witnessed it all, the desert went on keeping time in the only way it knew, patiently, relentlessly, forever.